Whoa. If he can't see me, he won't attack. Oh. So we start our last section, the section on nightmares, which is relatively short because it's a subset of dreams, so we don't have to set an entire stage here. Now again, this was, or is, a 1-credit class, so there is a lot of detail that we're not necessarily picking up here that we would if it was 2 or 3 credits. So we're getting a flyby of this field overall. So if you're interested in the subject area, there's a lot more to it than what we're covering here. So again, when we talk nightmares, of course, we have to kind of buzzkill it by going on to the research side and defining it. What counts as a nightmare? Oh, that's going to depend on the researcher. But let's go to the clinical side for a moment. Clinically, a nightmare is an emotionally troubling dream that causes you to wake and causes emotional distress upon waking. Totally legit, and we're gonna, when we review again later nightmare disorder, it's one of the criteria there. We're gonna be more broad here with what counts as a nightmare. We're just gonna say any negative or unpleasant dream, or a dream that even if it doesn't wake you up while you're having it, it causes negative moods, negative feelings to linger after you've woken from it. So for our criteria, that's going to be enough to count as a nightmare. What causes nightmares? Oh, well, a lot of stuff. Actually, we're going to look at some detailed stuff in a minute. But in general, 2 primary things are almost always there when something counts as a nightmare. Either anxiety or worry is generating them, or activity of the amygdala. That determines whether you are going to interpret an experience as just weird versus scary. Weird. I can have a content of a dream that could be terrifying, but unless my amygdala is firing off with it, I may just think it's weird. I may just think, wow, that's bizarre. Imagine that I'm just alone in town. I'm the only one in town. Is that just kind of weird and mysterious and cool? Or is that terrifying that I'm the only one? That can be based on whether the amygdala is firing off with it or not. If somehow, again, I was able to be monitoring you while you were having a dream, let's say I actually had a screen that was displaying for me what was going on in a dream you were having, and I could read your physiological responses to know that you don't seem to be having a fear response. But if I could magically fire off your amygdala at that moment, that otherwise just mysterious cool dream would suddenly be terrifying and would be a nightmare. Again, we mentioned in the sleep disorders, one of the theories of sleep terror is that it's the amygdala firing off, causing a fear response, regardless of what the content of your dream is. So let's look at a picture of the brain here. Where's the amygdala? It's right there, not too far away from the hippocampus. This doesn't show the olfactory bulb and your sense of smell. But another thing, we may have mentioned it earlier, the hippocampus, well, basically your sense of smell in general, is one of the ones that goes to deeper brainstem areas before going to the thalamus. A lot of your sensory input goes to the thalamus first. In the case of the amygdala and the sense of smell, those go pretty direct, which is why a smell can trigger a memory and a smell can trigger an emotion, because they are very, basically very primal in there. A lot of people will say the amygdala specializes in negative emotion. As we've mentioned before, the amygdala actually can cause elevation of any emotion that you're having at the moment it fires it off. But in the case of dreams especially, it seems to cause negative emotions, especially in a REM, where it's likely to fire off in those cases. So let's look at some more specific causes of nightmares. We already mentioned anxiety. Stress in general can do it. Trauma or anything upsetting that happened to you in your waking life. If your sleep schedule is messed up, or you're sleep deprived, or you have an illness of some kind, that can trigger nightmares. Substances can as well. Medication or any sort of drug withdrawal, which has a negative impact on the body, can also cause nightmares. Sleep apnea is a big one. Again, in sleep apnea, when you stop breathing, you may actually have a nightmare that you are suffocating or drowning or buried or trapped somewhere where you can't get out and can't breathe. If you associate that as well with sleep paralysis, that's a very startling nightmare in that regard. Any of the sleep disorders we talked about can trigger nightmares. And eating shortly before bed, because eating increases metabolism, that increases brain activity, that can introduce that. So that last one, eating and the increase in metabolism, think of that as a template that lays over all these others. If I have underlying issues with any of these, that increase in brain activity due to an increase in metabolism can trigger any of those. Now, a lot of you may have these situations and not have nightmares at all. Some people have very few nightmares. Some people have them triggered very easily. So there's no guarantee here on what's going to serve them, what's going to produce them. Do nightmares serve a function? Ooh, let's go back to a couple snippets from the Why Do We Dream video. Yeah.
The nature of bad dreams and nightmares is that they contain threatening events, and they force us to go through those simulated threatening events in order that in the waking world we encounter similar or different kinds of threatening events, and then we are more prepared to survive those. Adults have very modern types of nightmares and bad dreams, like losing your wallet, crashing your car, or something like that. So it seems our brain is capable of adjusting itself and including more modern threats. Without nightmares and bad dreams, there is a good chance that humanity wouldn't be here.
Again, the whole idea that some nightmares actually prepare us for real-world situations and real-world challenges. And that is probably very true. I can tell you one that I have frequently that I really didn't start to notice until a couple of years ago, when I started to study dreams and nightmares and looking into this stuff. And that's that prior to the beginning of a quarter, usually a couple weeks before the quarter starts, if I don't have my syllabus ready, and if I don't have all my materials ready to go for at least the first week, I will start to have nightmares about the first day of class. That I show up, I don't have my syllabus, I don't have my laptop, I don't have stuff ready to go, or I don't know how to use the tech in the room or something weird there. But I found when I noticed that, if I get the syllabus done and if I get all my stuff for at least that first week done and ready to go, so I could hit the ground right now with it, those nightmares disappeared. In that case, they are definitely nightmares based on both anxiety or a feeling of a lack of preparedness, and I can make them go away just by fixing that part of it. It's not relevant here, but I also have a recurring dream there where one of my classes is in like this really big room that's like a nightclub. So it's really dark and it has multiple levels to it. And I lecture from what is like a DJ pit or something up there, where I go up to this area and there's all this awesome equipment and I can't actually see most of the class. I don't know where that comes from, but that would be a cool room to lecture in. Tell you what. Oh, yeah, like to do that. But another one here, the last bullet, when we say emotional homeostasis or homeostasis, the thought of that is that each of us has a genetically based kind of baseline, emotional baseline. And if you look into studies on happiness or subjective well-being, there's a lot of theories in there that say part of our subjective well-being from an emotional standpoint is genetically set. So we have some sort of baseline. When events in the real world drag us around that baseline, it creates instability and can cause us distress. So that kind of piggybacks on this theory that if I've encountered a lot of stressors during the day, if I'm really kind of wound up when I go to bed, nightmares serve as a way for me to vent that. It gives me an environment, the nightmare environment, in which I can encounter a terrifying thing and deal with it in a way I haven't dealt with emotion during the day. That sounds a little vague, but let's go to, some of you may have heard of Robert Sapolsky, who wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it talks about how humans deal with stress. And I'm going to really severely oversimplify this example because it's a 1-credit class, so I can get away with that. Animals in the wild, when they encounter a stressor, they will basically emotionally and biologically just process through it. I've had my trauma, I deal with my trauma, I move on. Humans try to stifle the emotional result of trauma. We try to control it. We try to keep it from having an impact on us, which means we don't let it play out. We don't let it complete. And that's one of the things quite often in counseling, when you're counseling someone who's gone through a trauma, is to help them complete that cycle. In fact, we find when people will, in a therapy session, talk through their traumatic experience from beginning to end, they have better outcomes 6 months later than people who continue to try to suppress it. Even if we have you write it out, here's the horrible thing that happened to me from beginning to end. It's painful in the moment you do it, but we find that seems to be kind of cathartic and helps you vent it. By the same token, nightmares are trying to do that for you too. Here's a horrible thing that happened to me. I didn't let myself emotionally process through it. So my brain's going to say, I'm going to set up a fictional dream scenario in which you can have that terror and give you a chance to process through it. And that's one of those theories there on the function of nightmares. Now, nightmare function, the research into that has also given us a big clue into some of the factors in PTSD, meaning post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, keep in mind here, this isn't an abnormal class, but I do have to back up for a moment. When we say post-traumatic stress, what we mean is it is stress-related symptoms that showed up a period of time after the event. So you may have gone through a trauma and seems like you came through it okay, but then at some future point you start to have stress-related responses and emotional-related responses to it. So we have other categories for stress and trauma symptoms that occur during and right after an event. PTSD is when we see things pop up later, and it can be a long time later. In the cases when the movie Saving Private Ryan came out, and it had a very graphic early scene of the Normandy invasion, a lot of veterans groups warned World War II veterans, maybe don't go to this movie, or if you do, go with people, go with a support group. And a lot of vets said, I have no problem with that. I've seen war movies, no problem. The problem with that movie specifically was And this is one of the reasons the sound editing people won an Academy Award for that movie. The sound of the bullets hitting the landers, that metal on metal sound, they reproduced that too accurately. And for a lot of guys who had been part of that landing, they had not heard that sound since the day it happened. And that sound coming through, especially in a theater where it's as loud as you may have heard it on that day, that triggered for them PTSD, even if they may not have had symptoms. And we're talking decades after the fact. This is why we advise people around the 4th of July, if you have a combat vet in your neighborhood, be kind of sympathetic there towards how they may be responding to the sounds of fireworks going off. But I'm going too far back here. Let's look at this second bullet, this first sub-bullet, internal versus external locus of control. What are we talking about there? Internal locus of control people have a tendency to feel like they have an influence over what happens to them. I am in control over what I do and what happens to me. External locus of control people feel a little more kicked around, a little less control over what happens to them. Now, let's not categorize these because that's kind of dangerous there. These are on a spectrum from internal on one end of the spectrum, external on the other, and there's a wide range in between. And you can actually move around on that depending on what the environment is we're talking about. Why do I bring that one up? If you Google PTSD and internal versus external locus of control, you're going to find a lot of studies that say external locus of control people are more prone to PSD. And these studies have been around for a long time. Problem with that is that external locus of control people are more likely to seek help for PTSD symptoms and therefore be overrepresented in the clinical population. The internal locus of control person is less likely to seek help because internal locus of control, I can deal with it, I can handle it. Just in the last decade, we're starting to suspect internal locus of control people, meaning the in control can handle anything kind of person, is the one most at risk of PTSD if you put them in a life-threatening situation. Now, why is that? Think about what causes PTSD, witnessing or experiencing a trauma, right? If I'm internal locus of control, and let's go to the extreme here and say I'm in a moment, an event is happening where my brain says, you're dead. We're not going to live through this. And I do live through it. That internal locus of control programming hates that. I should be able to handle things. I should be able to control it. And that one, I couldn't. So what happens then afterward? When your brain is grabbing nightmare scenarios in order to prepare you for real world events, rather than grabbing something fictional, the worst thing in your database is that thing that really happened to you. So it'll grab that and it'll keep throwing it in there. So you'll have recurring nightmares about the event because your brain wants to figure out, how could we have avoided this? How could we have processed through this? And it'll keep it coming. And when we say a snowball effect there, basically mean recurring severe nightmares that wake you up result in sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation results in not just mood disorder, but as we saw in the sleep disorder section, a lot of other problems along with that. So there's a lot of researchers who look at this as possibly one of the early signs of PTSD. So this other slide mentions recurring nightmares that persist. Again, if they fit the criteria for nightmare disorder, may be an early sign. What does it mean here when we say imagery rehearsal? And that's where in a clinical setting, you have someone imagine the scenario, visually remember it, and play it out in a different way in which you control the scenario. And do this repeatedly. Basically train your brain to think of this trauma as something that you can resolve. What we found is that will work into that dream imagery. Now, another sidebar I don't have on the slides here, one of the problems here, and we're not going to go way into memory on this again. We mentioned earlier, if you remember something wrong, that can get put into the original memory and distort it. In a lot of cases of PTSD, the nightmares will actually amp up the terror of the event. It'll make them worse. So in a nightmare, you may see something really graphic that you didn't see in the original event, but that nightmare image will intrude and incorporate into part of the original memory. This happens to us in dreams too. You can have just a normal dream about something, and about something that happened during your day, but your dream incorporates some new thing into it that will become part of your original memory, and you won't know your dream has just distorted your memory there. So we mentioned nightmare disorder. Let's flip this slide back on here and kind of review that one again. Again, repeated occurrences. When we say extremely dysphoric, that means emotionally uncomfortable and disturbing. Well-remembered dreams. Again, they're usually threats to survival or safety in it. Usually in the second half of the major sleep episode, because nightmares tend to occur in REM, and you do more REM in the second half of the night. And on awakening, you become alert pretty quickly, as opposed to sleep terror, where you don't. And again, as it mentions, almost exclusively in REM there. Now, the second half of the night, the greater tendency to have REM there. That's why one of the suggestions that we'll see at the end on how to avoid nightmares is try not to sleep in too much, especially if you notice, like say I sleep in on Saturdays and I notice I'm more likely to have nightmares on Saturdays. That may be because I sleep longer than I normally would, and that extra time is greater REM time, and that's where I'm more likely to have them. Again, for some people, and let's talk about an individual difference here. For some people, nightmares are terrifying and uncomfortable, and they don't want to have them. For other people, nightmares are kind of an interesting adventure because they wake up and, well, it's not the real world. It's not really going on. And they kind of enjoy having a nightmare now and then, depending on the content of it. Let's look at some common nightmares. We mentioned kind of these in the dreams section. About your teeth and hair falling out, and we talked about why those can occur. Again, the parietal lobe kind of shutting off your perception. But we also mentioned how there's a correlation here to how important other people's perception of you is. Because a lot of the times when you have a nightmare that your teeth are falling out or your hair is falling out, it is associated with having people see you like that, or having to encounter people once this has happened. So that can be an indicator that part of it is how important it is for you for people to have a positive impression of you. Doesn't guarantee that there are self-esteem issues there, but self-esteem issues can kind of lead into that. Being chased, a really common one. Again, in the BBC documentary, they talked about how most of the time in dreams, something is going on. You're pursuing something, you're looking for something. The reverse of that is being chased by something. There's some sort of progression to it, at least in the ones that you remember. And you can be getting chased, usually you're getting chased by something scary. And this is also why we can't throw in universal interpretations on flying. People will say, oh, flying means this, flying means that. Sometimes in a dream, when you're being chased, you'll suddenly be able to jump up and fly away from the threat. Other times you won't be able to, which means we can't say flying has some deep integrated personality trait indicator to it if we can find differences in when it pops up. So again, being chased or pursued or followed, and the fear that comes with that. Falling, we mentioned this one in the previous section, big parietal lobe thing here, because you actually feel falling. How can you feel falling in a dream if you've never really fallen from a far distance? It's because your brain does have that experience of a dip. If you've ever driven fast over a bridge or a dip in the road, you get that feeling in your legs or your groin from it, the going down sensation of a roller coaster. So if you're a skydiver or bungee jumper, you have an even more vivid memory in your head of what it feels like to be falling. Again, universal meanings of these, none. This can just pop in. Your brain can randomly just, maybe you were having a flying dream and then all of a sudden, bam, you can't fly anymore. Doesn't necessarily mean anything universal in this case. And again, most of the time, it has to do with your parietal lobe kicking on and off, giving you a body sensation during the night. Being naked in an inappropriate place. We mentioned toilets in the last one, which fall into the nightmare category also, that you're suddenly on a toilet in a meeting or in a class, and that's kind of weird and embarrassing. Again, just public embarrassment. It doesn't mean anything about you personally. In fact, these are really common. The reason we can't say naked dreams have a universal meaning is because almost everyone has them. And we can't start saying specific things about people's traits if it's an extremely common trait in the general environment. That's why none of these things that say there are 6 types of people in the world, which one are you? There's 7 billion people in the world. If we divide them into 6 traits, there is no predictive value in that at all. Usually the naked in public, again, is just your brain playing with your anxieties. And oh my God. Now, a common one associated with this is just trying to get dressed, not being able to find your clothes. You're trying to put clothes on and you're having trouble putting them on, and it's taking forever. One little mental exercise to plant in your head here: if you have a dream where you're suddenly in a class or a meeting and you're naked, especially if it's a lucid dream, at least try to realize you got there naked. You weren't embarrassed then. Just roll with it. Say, whoa, check it out. I'm naked. I'm going to leave and find something to put on. Just kind of roll with it there. But again, it is related to basically your brain playing through embarrassing scenarios. And a lot of these, you'll see a lot of these common dreams involve negative feelings or embarrassment. And part of that is we are social creatures. We are designed to have kind of this social radar out there and pay attention to how others perceive us, and kind of want them to perceive us in a positive way. Even hermits or recluses, people who claim they don't want to be around people, it is very rare for a recluse to actually go off into the woods where there's no one around. A lot of recluses are reclusive in populated areas. So it's not that they don't want anyone around, it's that they don't want to interact with anyone, and that's a different thing altogether. True recluse is going to go off somewhere where they never have to see anyone. But a lot of people are reclusive to the extent that I don't want to interact with people, but my brain kind of wants the feeling of people around. A little nugget, not quite related to this, is why you could be sitting there on an afternoon watching a movie on broadcast TV and just sitting through the long commercial breaks on it, when you maybe have that movie on DVD on your shelf, or you could go over to a streaming service and watch it uninterrupted. But there's a different feeling to it watching it on live TV, where other people are watching it at the same time. Someone at that network is broadcasting it right now. That has a different social feeling to it than just pulling it off the shelf and watching it by yourself. That has a different kind of isolated feeling to it. So our social component is a big driver in a lot of these nightmares. So being late for something, or not being prepared well for something, failing a test, failing a job interview, again, failure dreams. These all fall into that category of dreams that are preparing you emotionally for a real world scenario. And again, the reason you may have weird science fiction, fictional elements brought in there is because your brain, while you're asleep, is grabbing anything that's stored in there that could scare you or bother you. And a lot of that is stored fictional data from books you've read, movies you've watched, TV shows you watch. Again, when the brain's pulling up memory for dreaming, it's not categorizing, hey, did this come from a TV show? It's just grabbing the raw content of it. So you can have some really weird nightmares there. And that's why from culture to culture, we will find differences in common nightmares. In more advanced cultures, you may have more sci-fi type nightmares because you're exposed to that kind of medium. In other cultures that don't have the same technological advances, you may have nightmares more commonly involving spirits, dead relatives, animal threats, natural environment threats such as storms, floods, things like that. Whatever gets into your head is a scary thing, that's what your brain will pull up. So another common one is you are dying or someone you care about is dying. And again, as we mentioned, this is in general, emotional loss is what this is. So what also counts in here is a loved one leaving you, not necessarily dying. Really common, especially early in a relationship, when you have a really strong connection and you are feeling like the other person has a strong connection to you. As this last bullet says, you may have a nightmare where you see your partner with someone else and they are obviously in love with them and you feel that rejection. Not only do you feel it, but they will somehow throw it in your face, turn and laugh at you or something. That's an indicator of how much that person means to you. It's not your subconscious telling you that they're going to lose you or leave you, I mean. It's just an indicator of how important that person has come to you. Now, this is where we get into one where some people claim to have nightmares that predict the future, because you will have a lot of cases where people said, I had a dream of my mother dying, and 3 weeks later my mother died. What they're not aware of is they probably had a lot of dreams where a loved one passed away, and it didn't happen, so that didn't cue it up. But when the dream happens sometimes in close proximity to the event, then it'll cue it up. And let's sidebar here back to dreams for a moment, because we have that same thing with just normal dreams. When we talk about how dreams will disappear in the morning as you're trying to remember them, you're just trying to cue it up and it's like it's dissolving. But if something happens during the day that's similar to an element in that dream, suddenly it will cue right back up, which tells us the dream did get encoded. So if it processed into memory, why did you have such a hard time remembering it? You want the answer to that? I can give you the answer to that. There is no answer to that yet. We don't know why that is. Makes no sense. It's weird. Brain is stupid. Stupid brain. Oh, so let's get into this. Let's wrap this bugger up. How can you reduce nightmares? Now, this is going to vary from person to person. If an irregular or weird sleep schedule is the reason you're having them, then try to set a regular sleep schedule where you go to bed at the same time, you try to get up at the same time. If you're noticing you have nightmares on days where you tend to sleep longer than usual, then try not to sleep in. In fact, let's say, and some people have done this, that they've chronicled where they will wake from nightmares around the same time every night. Like they wake up terrified and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, or 3:15, or 3:20, sometime within that range. One of the things you can do, at least if you don't have insomnia and have trouble getting back to sleep, is set an alarm about 15 minutes prior to that common time. Have it wake you up, shut it off, go right back to sleep, because you're resetting your cycle then. Limit caffeine and alcohol, especially before bed. Some people think caffeine keeps you awake. For some people it does. For other people, caffeine can cause you to have very intense dreams rather than keeping you from falling asleep. Practice relaxation, because remember when we talked about emotional homeostasis, the idea that pent-up anxieties will bring on nightmares in the attempt to vent those anxieties. So try to just chill yourself out before bed and relax before that. Daily exercise. Exercise across the board resets almost and stabilizes almost everything. And it doesn't mean you have to go to a gym or have to work out. You can go for walks, whatever it is. Get some motion, get your heart pumping, because that helps kind of that not only brain but body homeostasis in there. Wake with the sun. Again, this is going to vary from individual to individual. When we say social clock, that means the society in general says morning is when you get up, the noontime is when you have lunch, evening is when you have dinner, and then you go to sleep sometime between 8 and midnight. That's kind of our social clock. We are kind of biologically designed to follow the sun in that regard. If you find your schedule is off, When we look back at the sleep disorders, the shift disorder, when you're working a different shift and it's messing up your sleep cycle, you may encounter nightmares during that. Now, that's one where you can't just change your sleep cycle if your job forces you into one. But if you can adjust back to a normal kind of day-night cycle, that may help. Avoid lying in bed while awake. If you've been there for a while and you can't get to sleep, and especially if you're getting anxious about not being able to get to sleep, get up and do something. Have a drink of water or something. Occupy yourself with something else, and then try going back to bed maybe 15 minutes or a half hour after that. Because if you're laying there awake and you're anxious about it, that is keeping you from settling down. The other option there, if you're lying in bed awake, is to try the relaxation. Try to distract your thoughts to something else. And keeping your bedroom cool, being too warm is one that can actually disturb your sleep cycle and is more likely to kind of bring you into, wake you up in lighter stages. And as we mentioned in the previous section, if you're too cold or too hot in your actual body, that may enter a dream also. There's a lot of people who in the winter will sleep with their bedroom window open, and they'll just put extra blankets on the bed because they find it's very comforting to feel the body heat type of warmth with cold room around them, and they tend to sleep better. If you're one of those people, you may be at risk of having both nightmare and sleep quality disorders in the summer when it gets really hot. Your body wants a cool room, and sometimes in the summer you don't get the option of the cool room. So we just went through, oh my God, that whole thing. That's the end of the class. That's it. That was just one credit. Oh man, love to do this someday as more credits so we could bring in more detail on this. Let me throw in some acknowledgments at the end here though. One of the first things when I heard I was going to get this class is I hit our little music room and recorded our theme music for it because I just love the dreamy stuff. But this tune you've heard a lot. My son Vincent did that one. Also technical assistance and the person who popped in every once in a while on some other videos, Natalie Peters, acknowledged there too. Thank you for participating. Let's go on. I think I'm going to wander into a nightmare right now because they're kind of exciting. Yeah, kind of exciting.